I still remember the faint hum of the air conditioning unit rattling in the corner of Harper Tour's Raleigh office, a cramped little space on the second floor of a faded brick building downtown. The summer heat pressed against the windows, turning the glass into a shimmering wall of haze, but inside it was cool. Too cool, almost sterile. The walls were lined with yellowing posters of smiling families on beach vacations and glossy shots of the Blue Ridge Mountains, all curling at the edges like they'd given up on selling the dream. A chipped wooden counter stretched across the room, and behind it sat Eleanor, my mother hunched over a ledger with a pencil stub gripped between her fingers. The scritch-scratch of her writing was the only sound breaking the stillness that and the occasional groan of a bus engine idling outside. I was 12, skinny as a rail, with a mop of brown hair that kept falling into my eyes no matter how many times I shoved it back. I perched on a wobbly stool beside her, my legs dangling, sneakers scuffing the linoleum floor. The office smelled like stale coffee and her lavender perfume, a mix that clung to my clothes long after I left. She didn't look up from her numbers, but I could tell she knew I was watching. Her lips twitched, just a flicker, like she was holding back a smile. "Jake," she said, finally, her voice low and steady, "quit staring and make yourself useful. Grab that fair sheet." She nodded toward a stack of papers teetering on the edge of the counter, dog-eared and smudged from years of handling. I slid off the stool, the metal creaking under me, and snatched the top sheet. It was a mess of columns, destinations, distances, passenger counts, prices, all scribbled in her tight, precise handwriting. What am I supposed to do with this? I asked, squinting at the numbers like they were some secret code I hadn't cracked yet. "Figure it out," she said, still not looking up. "Mrs. Callahan's group wants a day trip to Wilmington. 22 people, round trip with a stop in Goldsboro for lunch. Tell me what it costs." I frowned, glancing between her and the paper. "You've got a calculator right there." Her pencil stopped mid-scratch. She turned her head, just enough to fix me with those sharp gray eyes of hers, the ones that could cut through any excuse I tried to throw up. "And you've got a brain, don't you? Use it." There was no arguing with that tone. I slumped back onto the stool, the fair sheet crinkling in my hands, and started running the numbers in my head. It wasn't easy, multiplying distances by rates, adding surcharges for the extra stop, dividing it out for the group size. My brow furrowed as I pictured the figures stacking up, shifting around like puzzle pieces. I muttered under my breath, 200 miles each way, times the base rate, plus 30 for Goldsboro. The numbers danced slippery at first, but then they locked into place. I could feel it, that little spark, igniting somewhere deep the thrill of chasing something down and pinning it. $486, I said after a minute, leaning forward, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. Eleanor didn't react right away. She tapped her pencil against the ledger, once, twice, then slid her calculator over and punched in the figures herself. The machine beeped softly, and she glanced at the display. Her eyebrow lifted just a fraction. "486, she confirmed, and this time the smile broke through, small but real. "Not bad, kid." I grinned, a rush of pride swelling in my chest. It wasn't just the math, it was her, the way she'd pushed me without even blinking. She went back to her ledger, but I could tell she was pleased. That was Eleanor Harper, never one for big praise, but when she gave you something, it stuck. The office door creaked open then, letting in a gust of muggy air and the rumble of traffic from the street below. My father, Tom, stepped in, his work boots thudding against the floor. He was a broad man, all shoulders and calluses, his flannel shirt stained with grease from the garage where he fixed the buses. His face was red, slick with sweat, and he carried the sharp tang of oil with him. "Ellie, we've got a problem," he said, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Number three's radiator's shot again. Won't make it to Durham tomorrow." Eleanor's pencil stilled. She didn't look at him right away, just pressed her lips into a thin line. "That's the second time this month," she said, her voice tight. "We can't keep patching it up, Tom. I know that." He snapped, louder than he needed to. "But we can't afford a new one either, can we?" The air shifted, heavy now like a storm rolling in. I slid lower on the stool, my eyes bouncing between them. This wasn't new. Money was always the jagged edge we teetered on. Harper Tours was ours, a family thing, but it was small, barely scraping by with a handful of buses and a few loyal customers. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on them, on us, even if I didn't fully understand it yet. Eleanor set her pencil down, deliberate, and turned to face him. "We'll figure it out," she said, but there was a crack in her calm, a flicker of something tired and frayed. Tom just shook his head and stalked toward the back room, muttering about parts and suppliers. I stared at the fare sheet, the numbers blurring a little, that spark from before dimmed, replaced by a gnawing ache I couldn't name. I wanted to fix them, but I was just a kid with a knack for math, sitting in a rundown office that felt smaller every day. Outside, the bus engine growled again, and I wondered how long we could keep this thing running before it all fell apart. The air in Charlotte felt different from Raleigh, sharper, somehow, like it carried the bite of ambition instead of the slow simmer of survival. I was 16 now, taller but still lanky, my hair still a mess no matter how much I tried to tame it. The classroom at West Charlotte High was a squat, beige box with flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sickly glow over the rows of chipped desks. The windows were streaked with grime, letting in slivers of late afternoon sun that painted the floor in uneven patches. It smelled faintly of chalk dust and sweat, the kind of place that felt alive with restless energy, kids shuffling papers and whispering about weekend plans. I sat near the back, my notebook open, pencil tapping against the edge of the page. Numbers sprawled across it, equations, half-solved problems, little scribbles in the margins where I'd chased a solution down a rabbit hole. School had always come easy to me, too easy sometimes, and that made me restless. The teachers noticed, sure, but most of them didn't know what to do with me, except for Sam Grayson. He wasn't like the others. Sam was a wiry man, maybe in his 40s, with a mop of salt and pepper hair and eyes that glinted like he was always 3 steps ahead of you. He taught math, but not the way the textbooks did, dry and rote like a chore. Sam turned it into a game, a duel. He'd stride into the room with that lopsided grin of his, chalk in hand, and toss out problems like grenades, waiting to see who'd flinch. Most kids did. I didn't. That day, he was late. The bell had rung 10 minutes ago, and the room was starting to hum with impatience when the door swung open. Sam stepped in, his tie loose, a stack of papers tucked under his arm. He didn't apologize, just dropped the papers on his desk with a thud and scanned the room. His gaze landed on me, and that grin flickered. "Harper," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter. "Up front." A ripple of murmurs followed me as I stood, my sneakers squeaking against the linoleum. I felt the weight of eyes on my back, some curious, some just glad it wasn't them. I stopped beside his desk, shoving my hands into the pockets of my jeans, trying to look like I didn't care, but I did. Sam had a way of pulling you in, making you want to prove something. He didn't say anything at first, just picked up a piece of chalk and started scribbling on the board. A mess of numbers and symbols, fractions tumbling over each other, exponents curling like traps. It wasn't anything we'd covered in class. My pulse kicked up a notch, that familiar spark flickering to life. I squinted at it, letting the pieces shift in my head. "Solve it," he said, stepping back and folding his arms. "No paper, no calculator, just you." The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that presses down on you thick and heavy. I could feel my classmates leaning forward, waiting for me to crash and burn. Part of me wanted to balk, tell him it was unfair, too hard, too fast. But then I thought of Eleanor, her gray eyes daring me to figure it out, and that old pride flared up hot and stubborn. I took a breath and stepped closer to the board. The numbers stared back at me, chaotic at first, but I could feel them bending, lining up. "Okay," I muttered more to myself than him. "Break it down. Start with exponents." My voice trailed off as I worked it in my head, multiplying, dividing, flipping fractions over like cards in a deck. It was messy, slippery, but I kept going, chasing that spark, until the chaos started to smooth out. 42, I said, finally turning to face him. My heart was hammering, but I kept my voice steady. Sam didn't move. He just stood there, arms still crossed, staring at me like he was trying to see straight through to the other side. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate, and scratched out the problem on the board, working it step by step. The chalk clicked against the slate, and when he finished, he circled the answer 42. A low whistle came from somewhere in the back. Someone clapped, quick and sharp, before the room erupted into a buzz. My face burned, but I couldn't stop the grin tugging at my lips. Sam tossed the chalk onto his desk and looked at me, that glint in his eyes brighter now. Not bad, kid, he said, echoing Eleanor's words from years back. Not bad at all. I nodded, the rush of it still buzzing under my skin, and headed back to my seat. The rest of the class blurred by. More problems, more lectures, but my mind was stuck on that moment, the way Sim had pushed me, and I'd pushed back. It felt good, like I'd claimed something. Later, as the bell rang and kids spilled into the hall, Sam called me over. He was leaning against his desk, flipping through those papers, but his eyes flicked up when I got close. You've got a gift, Jake, he said, his tone quieter now, serious. Numbers bend for you. Not many people can do that. I shrugged, scuffing my shoe against the floor. It's just math. No, he said, sharp enough to make me look up. It's more than that. It's how you think, fast, clear, fearless. That's rare. I didn't know what to say to that. Praise wasn't something I was used to, not like this. Eleanor's approval was hard-won, but spare. Tom's was buried under grease and gritted teeth. Sam's felt different, direct, like he saw something in me I hadn't named yet. He straightened, tapping the papers against the desk. You ever think about what you're going to do with it? With what? I asked, frowning. That head of yours. He smirked, but there was an edge to it, something expectant. Worlds bigger than Raleigh, bigger than this classroom. You could go places, Harper. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. The idea snagged in my chest, vague, unformed, but heavy. Back home, Harper Tours was limping along, the buses breaking down faster than Tom could fix them, Eleanor's ledgers growing thinner every month. I'd always figured I'd end up there, behind that chipped counter, keeping the numbers straight. But Sam's words cracked that picture open, and for the first time, I wondered what else there might be. Before I could say anything, he waved me off. Think about it, he said, already turning back to his papers. We'll talk more. I left the room, the hallway loud with slamming lockers and shouting voices, but my head was somewhere else. That night, lying on my bed in our cramped little house, I stared at the ceiling, the hum of a bus engine drifting in from the street. Sam's challenge replayed in my mind, mixing with the memory of Eleanor's steady gaze and Tom's tired frustration. Something was shifting, a thread pulling tight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was where it started, where I started. The air in our cramped Raleigh apartment felt thick that night, heavy with the scent of fried onions from dinner and the faint mildew that clung to the walls no matter how much Eleanor scrubbed them. The living room was a tight square, barely big enough for the sagging couch and the chipped coffee table littered with bills and bus schedules. A single lamp buzzed in the corner, casting jagged shadows across the peeling wallpaper, floral once. Maybe now just a tired smear of beige and green. Outside, the streetlights flickered, their hum mixing with the distant growl of a bus engine winding down for the night. It was late past 10, and the world felt smaller somehow, pressed in by the weight of everything we didn't say. I sprawled across the couch, one leg slung over the armrest, my calculus textbook open on my lap. The pages were dog-eared, equations underlined in smudged pencil where I'd wrestle them into submission. Sam's words from earlier that week still rattled around in my head. Asterisk, you could go places, Harper, asterisk, like a dare. I wasn't sure I could answer. I chewed the end of my pencil, staring at a problem I'd already solved twice, just to keep my hands busy. The numbers clicked into place easy enough, but my mind was elsewhere, snagged on the creak of the floorboards as Eleanor moved around the kitchen. She stepped into the room then, her shadow stretching long across the floor. Her hair was pulled back, gray streaks catching the light, and her hands were still damp from washing dishes, leaving dark spots on the hem of her faded sweater. She carried a tin box, old, dented, the kind that might have held cookies once, but now just rattled with whatever she stashed inside. I straightened up, the textbook sliding shut with a soft thud. "Jake," she said, her voice quieter than usual, almost careful. She sat on the edge of the coffee table, close enough that I could smell the lavender on her, faint now, worn thin by the day. "We need to talk." My stomach twisted. Talks like this never ended well. Not with the way Tom's temper had been flaring lately, or the way the ledgers at Harper Tours kept bleeding red ink. I swung my legs down, sitting up proper, and tried to read her face. Those gray eyes of hers were steady, but there was something flickering behind them, worry, maybe, or resolve. I couldn't tell. About what? I asked, keeping my tone light, like I could dodge whatever was coming. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she set the tin box between us and popped the lid. Inside was a mess of papers, receipts, folded notes, a couple of crumpled 20s, and beneath it all, a small stack of savings bonds, edges curling like they'd been handled too many times. My breath caught. I knew what those were, even if I'd never seen them up close. Money. Real money, not the loose change we scraped together for groceries. "I've been putting this away," she said, her fingers brushing the bonds like they were fragile. "Not much, but it's something. For you. For me?" I echoed, the words sticking in my throat. I leaned forward, peering into the box, my mind racing to add it up. 500, maybe 1,000 if we were lucky. It wasn't a fortune, but in our world, it might as well have been gold. "For school," she clarified, her gaze locking onto mine. "College. Something beyond this." She waved a hand vaguely, taking in the apartment, the buses, the life we were barely holding together. I blinked, the weight of it slamming into me. College. The word felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else, someone who didn't spend their days dodging Tom's moods or crunching numbers to keep a failing business afloat. Sam had planted the seed. Sure, but this was Eleanor watering it, making it real. My chest tightened, a mix of pride and panic churning inside me. "Where'd you get it?" I asked, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. "We can't even fix the buses, Mom." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a second I thought she might snap back. But she didn't. She just sighed a small, tired sound and ran a hand through her hair. "I've been skimming," she said finally. "$1 here, 2 there. Fares that didn't make it to the books. Took years." I stared at her, the confession sinking in. Eleanor Harper, the woman who'd taught me right from wrong with a look that could stop a freight train, had been stealing. For me, the thought twisted something deep, a knot of guilt and gratitude I couldn't untangle. "You didn't have to do that," I said, quieter now. "Yes, I did," she shot back, her tone sharpening. "You think I don't see it, Jake? The way you light up with those numbers, the way Sam talks about you? You're better than this. Better than me and your father scrabbling to keep the lights on." Her words hit hard, stripping away the bravado I'd been clinging to. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that I could stay and fix things, fix Harper Tours, fix us. But the truth was, I didn't know if I could. The buses were dying, Tom was drowning, and she was fading, her hands trembling more than they used to, her memory slipping in ways we didn't talk about. "What about you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "And Dad? If I go, who's gonna will manage?" She cut in, firm but not harsh. "We always have. This isn't about us. It's about you getting out." Out. The word hung there heavy and jagged. I looked at the bonds again, the numbers blurring as my eyes stung. Part of me wanted to grab them and run. Chase that spark Sam saw, build something big, something mine. But another part, the part that still heard Tom's boots thudding through the office, that still felt Eleanor's pencil scratching out her survival, wanted to shove the box back and stay. Loyalty or ambition, I didn't know which was right, and the not knowing burned. Before I could say anything, the front door banged open and Tom stormed in. His face was flushed, eyes bloodshot, the stink of grease and cheap whiskey rolling off him. He froze when he saw us, the tin box open like an accusation. "What's this?" he growled, his voice low and dangerous. He took a step closer, boots scuffing the floor, and I felt Eleanor tense beside me. "Nothing," she said, too quick, snapping the lid shut. "Just sorting some papers." His eyes narrowed, flicking between us. "Don't look like nothing." He reached for the box, but I was faster, snatching it off the table and tucking it under my arm. My heart pounded. Loud enough, I swore he could hear it. "Leave it, Dad," I said, standing up, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's mine." He stared at me, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. For a second, I thought he might swing. His fists had been itching for a fight lately, but then he just snorted a sharp, ugly sound and turned away. "Fine. Keep your damn secrets," he muttered, stomping toward the bedroom. The door slammed behind him, rattling the walls. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding, the tin box cold against my ribs. Eleanor reached over, her hand squeezing my arm, brief but firm. "He's just tired," she said, but it sounded hollow, like she didn't believe it either. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The room felt smaller now, the air thicker, the shadows sharper. I sank back onto the couch, the textbook forgotten, the bonza weight I couldn't shake. Sam's challenge, Eleanor's sacrifice, Tom's unraveling, it was all colliding, and I was caught in the middle, grasping for answers I didn't have. Outside, the bus engine coughed and died, leaving a silence that pressed down hard. I stared at the tin box, my fingers tracing the dents, and wondered how long I could keep pretending I knew what came next. The air in Grayson Innovations' Charlotte headquarters felt like it belonged to another world. One I'd only glimpsed through cracked bus windows and Sam's half-formed promises. The lobby stretched wide and sterile, all glass and steel, with a polished marble floor that threw back warped reflections of the people striding across it. Men in crisp suits and women in sharp heels moved with purpose, their voices low and clipped, swallowed by the hum of an unseen air system that kept the place cool and odorless. A towering digital clock glowed red above the reception desk, 9:47 a.m., its seconds ticking down like a heartbeat I could feel in my chest. I stood there, 21 now, my tie borrowed and too tight, my palms slick against the folder clutched in my hands. Inside it were my resume, college transcript, and a letter from Sam Grayson himself, now president of this gleaming empire. It was my ticket, my shot, and it felt heavier than it should have. I'd been summoned for an interview. Me, Jake Harper, the kid who'd once balanced Harper Tour's books on a wobbly stool. The thought should have lit me up, but instead it gnawed. 2 months ago, Tom had died. His heart gave out in the garage, slumped over a busted engine, grease still smeared across his knuckles. Eleanor found him, and I found her hours later, staring blankly at the kitchen table, her hands trembling over a cup of tea she never drank. The dementia had crept in fast after that, stealing her sharp edges, leaving gaps where her memory used to be. Harper Tours was gone now, sold off for parts to pay the bills, and that tin box of bonds had got me through college, barely. This job wasn't just a chance, it was survival. The receptionist, a woman with a tight bun and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, waved me toward the elevators. 10th floor, she said, her voice flat. "Mr. Caldwell's waiting." I nodded, stepping into the glass box that shot me upward, the city shrinking beneath me through the transparent walls. My stomach lurched, not from a height, but from the name. Ethan Caldwell. Sam had warned me about him. Vice president, gatekeeper, a man who liked to break people before letting them in. I'd faced tough rooms before, but this felt different, like stepping onto a chessboard where I didn't know the rules. The elevator dinged, spitting me out into a hallway lined with frosted glass doors. A plaque read executive suite, and the air here was thicker, weighted with something I couldn't name. Power, maybe, or the promise of it. A young guy in a gray suit brushed past me, his briefcase swinging, and I caught a whiff of expensive cologne that made me feel cheaper than I already did. I squared my shoulders, smoothed the front of my jacket, secondhand but clean, and pushed through the door marked Conference Room B. Inside, the room was a fortress of dark wood and leather. A long table, dominated the space, its surface gleaming under recessed lights that cast no shadows. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Charlotte skyline, all sharp edges and morning haze, but the view felt distant, like it was taunting me from the other side of a wall I hadn't breached yet. The air smelled faintly of polish and coffee, and it pressed down tight and heavy, like the room itself was sizing me up. Ethan Caldwell sat at the far end, alone, his chair swiveled to face me. He was younger than I'd expected, mid-30s, maybe with a lean frame and a face carved from angles, all cheekbones and a jawline that could cut glass. His suit was tailored slate gray, and his blonde hair was swept back, not a strand out of place. But his eyes, pale blue, cold as ice, locked onto me, and I felt the temperature drop. "Jake Harper," he said, not rising, his voice smooth and sharp, like a blade wrapped in silk. He tapped a pen against a stack of papers, my file, I guessed, and leaned back, one ankle crossed over his knee. "Sam's golden boy. Sit." I took the chair across from him, the leather creaking under me, and set my folder on the table. My pulse kicked up, but I kept my face steady, meeting his gaze. I'd learned that much from Eleanor. Never let them see you flinch. "Thanks for having me," I said, keeping it simple. He didn't respond right away, just watched me, those eyes dissecting, like he was peeling back layers to find the flaw. Then he smirked a small, smug twist of his lips and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "Let's cut the pleasantries," he said. "Solve this." I glanced down. Numbers sprawled across the page, fractions, exponents, a tangle of operations that didn't line up neat like a textbook problem. It was chaos, deliberate and mean, designed to trip me up. My throat tightened, but that old spark flickered, the one Eleanor had stoked, the one Sam had dared me to chase. I looked back at him, his smirk widening, and something hot flared in my chest, defiance maybe, or just the need to wipe that look off his face. "No calculator?" I asked, my tone drier than I felt. "You won't need one," he said, leaning forward now, elbows on the table. "If you're half what Sam says, you'll do it in your head. Go on." The room shrank around us, the skyline fading, the air growing taut. I could feel his confidence pressing in, smug and suffocating, daring me to fail. Part of me wanted to shove the paper back, tell him where he could stick it, but then I thought of Tom, dead under a bus hood, and Eleanor lost in a fog I couldn't pull her from. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about them, about clawing out of the hole we'd been buried in. I took a breath, slow and deep, and let the numbers sink in. They danced at first slippery and wild, but I pinned them down piece by piece. "Break it apart," I muttered under my breath, my fingers twitching against the table. Exponents first, then the fractions. My mind raced, flipping terms, multiplying, dividing, the chaos bending under my grip. Ethan's pen tapped a slow rhythm, each click a taunt, but I tuned it out. The spark caught, burned brighter, and the answer snapped into focus. 78. I said, leaning back, my voice steady despite the sweat prickling my neck. His pen stopped. He didn't move, just stared at me, the smirk frozen on his face. Then he reached for a calculator, sleek, black, the kind that cost more than my rent, and punched in the figures. The beep of each key echoed, sharp and final, and when the screen lit up, his eyebrows twitched just a fraction. He set the calculator down, deliberate, and looked at me again like he was seeing me for the first time. 78, he confirmed, his tone flat, but there was a crack in that smug armor, a flicker of something, surprise, maybe, or irritation. He tossed the pen onto the table, the clatter loud in the silence, and leaned back. "Well, damn." I didn't smile, didn't gloat. I just held his gaze, my heart pounding, but my hands still. That moment stretched, heavy and electric, and I knew it. This was the turn, the hinge everything swung on. I'd walked in a nobody, a kid from a busted family with a borrowed tie, and now I was something else. Not just Sam's protege, not just Eleanor's hope, but a player, a contender. The room felt different now, the power shifting, subtle but real. Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the spell, and shuffled the papers in front of him. "You're not what I expected," he said, his voice smoother now, recalibrating. "Sam said you were quick, but that..." He trailed off, then smirked again, smaller this time, less certain. Let's see how you handle the rest. The door opened then, and Sam Grayson stepped in, taller than I remembered, his hair grayer, but that lopsided grin still intact. He glanced between us, his eyes glinting like he'd caught the tail end of a fight and liked the score. "Ethan, giving you hell already, Jake?" he asked, clapping a hand on my shoulder as he pulled out a chair. "Something like that," I said, my voice steady, but inside I was reeling. Tom's death, Eleanor's fade, the weight of that tin box, it had all funneled me here, to this room, this moment. And now, with Sam's hand on my shoulder and Ethan's cold eyes sizing me up, I felt that the game had changed. I wasn't just playing for survival anymore. I was playing for something bigger, something I could taste, sharp and dangerous, on the edge of my tongue. The conference room at Grayson Innovations felt like a cage now, its polished surfaces and towering windows closing in despite the space. The air was still cool, still sterile, but it carried a charge now, a hum of tension that prickled my skin as Sam Grayson settled into the chair beside me. His presence shifted the room, the weight of his authority pressing against Ethan Caldwell's icy control. My pulse hadn't settled from a math problem, that sharp 78 still echoing in my head. But this wasn't over. Ethan's smirk might have cracked, but those pale blue eyes were regrouping, recalculating, and I could feel the next move brewing. Sam leaned back, his lopsided grin steady, but his gaze flicked between me and Ethan with a glint I couldn't quite read, amusement maybe, or something deeper. So he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade through fog, "You didn't break him yet, Caldwell. That's a first." Ethan's lips twitched, a faint shadow of that smugness creeping back. He tapped his pen against the table again. Slower this time, deliberate. "Not for lack of trying," he said, his tone smooth but edged like he was testing the waters. "Your boy's got a head on him, I'll give you that. But we're not here for parlor tricks, are we?" I bristled at that. Asterisk parlor tricks asterisk, the words slicing into the triumph I'd just clawed out. My hands flexed against the leather arms of the chair, but I kept my mouth shut. Sam had taught me that much, don't swing until you see the opening. And right now, Ethan was baiting me, his gaze sliding over me like I was some puzzle he hadn't figured out yet. Sam chuckled, low and rough, the sound filling the room. "No," he said, "we're here for the real thing. Jake's not just quick, Ethan. He's steady. You don't build what we've got here without people who can handle the heat." The heat, I felt it now, radiating from the tension between them, from the skyline, glaring through the glass, from the weight of my own desperation. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a battlefield, and I was caught in the crossfire of something bigger than me. Grayson Innovations wasn't Harper Tours, a scrappy little outfit bleeding out in Raleigh. This was power, real power, the kind that shaped cities and broke men. And I wanted it. God help me, I did, more than I'd ever admitted to myself. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on the table, his fingers steepled as he fixed me with that cold stare. "Steady, huh," he said, his voice dropping, almost soft, but it carried a bite. "Let's see about that. Tell me, Harper, why are you really here? Sam's got a soft spot for you, sure, but I don't buy the golden boy act. What's driving you?" The question hit like a punch, sharp and unexpected. I opened my mouth, then stopped, the rehearsed lines about opportunity and ambition dissolving on my tongue. Why was I here? The folder in front of me held the polished version, college grad, math whiz, Sam's protege, but the truth was Messier uglier. Tom's grease-stained hands, cold on the garage floor. Eleanor's trembling fingers clutching a ledger she couldn't read anymore. The tin box, emptied out to get me through school, a hollow echo of her sacrifice. I was here because I had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. I swallowed, my throat dry, and met Ethan's gaze head on. "I'm here because I'm good," I said, my voice steady despite the churn in my gut. "Better than good. And I'm here because I've got no choice. You want to know what's driving me? It's survival. Mine and what's left of my family." The room went still, the air thickening around us. Ethan's eyebrows lifted just a fraction, and Sam shifted beside me, his grin fading into something quieter, heavier. I hadn't meant to say that much, Hadn't meant to crack open the raw edge of it, but there it was, sprawled out on the table like a spilled deck of cards. For a second, I wanted to yank it back, bury it under the polish of my resume, but it was too late. Ethan didn't flinch. He just watched me, those icy eyes narrowing as if he'd finally found the flaw he'd been hunting for. Survival, he repeated, rolling the word around like he was tasting it. That's honest, at least. But this isn't a charity, Harper. We don't hand out jobs because someone's got a sob story. I'm not asking for a handout. I shot back, heat rising in my chest. I solved your damn problem, didn't I? You want steady? That's me. You want someone who'll fold under pressure? Look somewhere else. Sam's hand landed on my shoulder again. Firm but not hard, a silent steady now. He's not wrong, Ethan, he said, his tone calm but pointed. You saw what he did. That's not just talent, that's grit. We need that. Ethan didn't respond right away. He leaned back, his pen tapping once, twice, then stilled. The silence stretched, taut, and suffocating, and I could feel the power shifting again, a tide pulling between them. I'd walked in here an outsider, a kid with a borrowed tie and a dead-end past, but now I was something else, a contender maybe or a threat, and Ethan didn't like it. I could see it in the tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers flexed against the table. Grit's one thing, he said finally, his voice low, controlled. But this place chews up people like you, Harper. Small-town kid with a chip on his shoulder? I've seen it before. You burn bright, then you burn out. And I don't have time to clean up the mess. The words stung, sharp and precise, because they weren't entirely wrong. I'd felt that burn, the late nights crunching numbers for Harper tours, the fights with Tom that left my knuckles raw, the quiet panic watching Eleanor fade. But I wasn't here to burn out. I was here to build something, to claw my way up from the wreckage, and I'd be damned if Ethan Caldwell was the one to stop me. Before I could fire back, Sam cut in. That's enough, he said, his voice harder now, the grin gone. You've had your fun, Ethan. Jake's not here to prove himself to you. He's here because I want him here. And last I checked, I still run this show. The room froze. Ethan's eyes flicked to Sam, a flash of something dark crossing his face. Anger, maybe, or resentment, but he masked it quick, that smooth control sliding back into place. He tossed the pen down, a small surrender, and leaned back his chair. Your call, boss, he said, the words clipped, but his gaze lingered on me, cold and assessing. Sam turned to me, his hand still on my shoulder, and I caught a glimpse of the man who dared me to solve that chalkboard mess years ago. You're in, Jake, he said, quiet but firm. Don't make me regret it. I nodded, my throat tight, the weight of it sinking in. In. I was in. But as Sam's hand dropped and Ethan stared into me, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The real fight wasn't the math problem or the interview. It was here in this room, in the shadow of their power, where ambition clashed with control, where survival meant more than just getting by. I could feel it, the hunger, the edge of something dangerous and alive, pulling me deeper. The skyline outside gleamed, sharp and untouchable, and for the first time, I let myself believe I could reach it. But as Ethan's pen started tapping again, slow and deliberate, I wondered what it would cost me, and who I'd have to become to pay it. The conference room at Grayson Innovations hadn't changed in the hour since I'd first walked in, but it felt different now, smaller, tighter, like the walls were inching closer with every breath. The leather chair beneath me creaked as I shifted, my borrowed tie digging into my neck, a noose I couldn't loosen. The Charlotte skyline loomed through the windows, its jagged edges glinting under a slate-gray sky, but the view offered no relief, just a reminder of how high I'd climbed and how far I could fall. The air hummed with that sterile chill, laced now with the faint scent of Sam's aftershave and the sharper tang of Ethan's presence, a predator circling. My hands rested on the table, fingers twitching against the polished wood, the echo of 78 still rattling in my skull. I'd won that round, but the victory tasted thin, fleeting, like a breath before the plunge. Sam's hand lifted from my shoulder, leaving a ghost of warmth as he leaned back in his chair, his lopsided grin a lifeline I clung to. You're in, he'd said, and the words should have steadied me, should have anchored me to this moment of triumph. But Ethan's cold blue eyes were still locked on me, unyielding, and the weight of his silence pressed down harder than any question he'd throw my way. The pen in his hand tapped once more, slow, deliberate, a metronome counting down to something I couldn't see. I'd cracked his smug exterior, sure, but I'd also painted a target on my back. This wasn't just a job anymore, it was a gauntlet, and I was only halfway through. Ethan straightened his chair, scraping faintly against the floor, and the sound jolted me back. He slid another sheet of paper across the table, this one thicker, the numbers denser, a labyrinth of equations and variables that sprawled like a trap. "You're quick, Harper," he said, his voice smooth as glass but edged with something darker. "Let's see if you're deep. This isn't some high school brain teaser. Solve it." I stared at the page, my pulse kicking up again, a drumbeat in my ears. The problem wasn't just complex, it was vicious, layered with twists that seemed to shift as I looked at them. Matrices tangled with logarithms, coefficients bleeding into each other, a mess designed not just to test me, but to break me. My mouth went dry, and for a split second, I saw Eleanor's gray eyes daring me to figure it out, Tom's grease-stained hands slamming a wrench against a busted engine. Failure wasn't an option, not then, not now. I swallowed hard, the taste of desperation sharp on my tongue, and reached for the paper. "No pencil," Ethan added, his smirk creeping back, a blade unsheathed. "In your head, like before." Sam shifted beside me, a low grunt escaping him, but he didn't intervene. His silence was a test, too. I realized his faith in me a rope I could either climb or hang myself with. I nodded, more to myself than Ethan, and let the numbers flood in. They hit like a storm, wild and relentless. But I dug in, my mind clawing through the chaos. "Start with the matrix," I muttered under my breath, fingers flexing as if I could feel the digits under my skin. "Reduce it, then the logs." The room faded, the skyline, the leather, Sam's steady breathing, all of it swallowed by the roar of my own focus. But this wasn't like before. The deeper I went, the tighter the knots grew, each step revealing another layer of complexity. My chest tightened, a vice squeezing my ribs, and sweat beaded at my temples despite the cool air. I could feel Ethan watching, his gaze a weight that pressed harder with every second. Doubt crept in, cold and insidious. Asterisk, what if I can't? What if this is where it ends? Asterisk, but I shoved it down, my jaw clenching until it ached. I wasn't just fighting the problem. I was fighting him, fighting the shadow of Harper Tour's collapse, fighting the image of Eleanor staring blankly at a wall she didn't recognize. Minutes stretched, the silence thickening until it felt like a living thing coiling around us. My head throbbed, the numbers blurring at the edges, but I kept going, chasing that spark, that clarity I'd always trusted. And then there, a thread pulled loose, a pattern clicking into place. I latched onto it, unraveling the mess piece by piece until the answer loomed, sharp and solid. 214, I said, my voice rough, almost a growl, as I leaned back and met Ethan's stare. He didn't move, didn't blink, just held my gaze like he could will me to crack. Then he reached for his calculator again, the same sleek black machine, and punched in the figures. The beeps were louder this time, each one a hammer strike, and when the screen flashed, his lips pressed into a thin line. 214, he said, setting the device down with a soft clack. His eyes flicked to Sam, then back to me, and the smirk was gone, replaced by something colder, harder, respect, maybe, or resentment. I couldn't tell. Sam let out a low whistle, breaking the tension like a snapped wire. "Told you," he said to Ethan, his grin widening. "Kid's got it." But Ethan wasn't done. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice dropping low, almost intimate. "You're good, Harper. Damn good. But that's not enough here. This place, it's a machine. It grinds people up, spits them out. You think you're ready for that? For the backstabbing, the deals, the weight of decisions that ruin lives?" The question hung there, heavy and barbed, and I felt it sink into me, rooting deep. I thought of Tom, his temper flaring as the buses broke down, his heart giving out under the strain. I thought of Eleanor, her sacrifice in that tin box, her mind slipping away while I chased this dream. I'd come here for them, for survival, for redemption, but Ethan was right. This wasn't Raleigh. This was a different beast, one that demanded more than quick math and grit. It demanded blood. I'm ready, I said, the words steady despite the storm inside me. I'd been fighting my whole life. This is just a bigger ring. Ethan's eyes narrowed, searching for the lie, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't, not now, not with Sam watching, not with everything I'd lost riding on this. He nodded, slow and deliberate, then pushed back from the table. We'll see, he said, standing up, his shadow stretching across the room. You got your shot. Don't waste it. He walked out, the door clicking shut behind him, and the air shifted again, lighter, but no less charged. Sam turned to me, his grin softer now, almost proud. You held your own, Jake. That's more than most can say. I nodded, my throat tight, but the triumph felt hollow. I'd beaten Ethan's game, twice, but the pressure hadn't lifted, it had doubled. I was in, sure, but in meant deeper into the machine Ethan had warned me about, into a world where every win came with a cost. My hands clenched into fists under the table, nails digging into my palms, and I wondered if I'd just traded one fight for another, one cage for a bigger one. Sam stood, motioning toward a door. Come on, he said. Let's get some coffee. You've earned it. I followed him out, the hallway stretching long and quiet, the weight of that paper still burning in my mind. 214. It wasn't just an answer. It was a line I'd crossed, a promise I'd made to myself, to Eleanor, to the kid I'd been behind that chipped counter. But as we stepped into the elevator, the city sprawling below us, I couldn't shake Ethan's words or the gnawing fear that he was right, and I wasn't ready at all. The coffee shop on the ground floor was a stark contrast to the executive suite. Warm wood tables, the hiss of an espresso machine, the murmur of voices blending into a low hum. Sam slid into a booth by the window, the glass streaked with morning condensation, and I sat across from him, the folder still tucked under my arm like a shield. He ordered us black coffees, no frills, and when they arrived, the steam curled up between us, a fragile barrier. You did good up there, he said, stirring his untouched cup, his eyes on me. Ethan's a bastard, but he's not wrong about this place. It's a grinder. I can handle it, I said, too quick, the words tasting like bravado, even to me. He raised an eyebrow, that glint back in his gaze. Can you? Look, Jake, I brought you here because I see something in you, same thing I saw back in that classroom. But this isn't about solving problems on a board anymore. It's about power. Who's got it? Who wants it? Who's willing to bleed for it? I took a sip of the coffee, bitter and scalding, and let his words settle. Power. I'd felt it up there, the shift in the room, the way Ethan's control had faltered. I wanted it more than I'd ever wanted anything, more than the buses, more than the tin box. But it scared me too, the hunger gnawing at me, the line it might push me to cross. Was I here for Eleanor, for Tom, or was I here for me, chasing something darker, something I couldn't name? What's it cost you? I asked, my voice low, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Running this place? Sam's grin faded, his face hardening for a moment, shadows pooling in the lines around his eyes. Everything he said simply, and then some. The answer hit me harder than Ethan's taunts, a quiet truth that echoed in the steam between us. I looked out the window, the city pulsing beyond the glass, and felt the weight of it all. The past I dragged here, the future I was grasping for the man I might become. I was in the machine now, gears turning, and there was no going back. The coffee shop faded behind me as I stepped back into the gleaming lobby of Grayson Innovations, the bitter taste of the brew still clinging to my tongue. Sam's words, asterisk everything, and then some asterisk echoed in my skull, a warning I couldn't shake as the elevator doors slid shut and the glass box hauled me upward again. My reflection stared back at me from the polished walls, distorted and fractured, the borrowed tie crooked now, my jaw tight with something I couldn't name, nerves maybe, or the first flicker of dread. I'd won the job, clawed my way into this machine, but the victory felt like a blade pressed against my throat, sharp and cold. The 10th floor loomed ahead, and with it, the real test. The executive suite was quieter now, the hallway stretching long and empty, the frosted glass doors catching the late morning light in smears of white. My sneakers, scuffed out of place against the pristine tiles, squeaked faintly as I approached conference room B again. Sem had told me to meet him here after coffee, but the air felt different, heavier, like the building itself was holding its breath. I pushed the door open, and the scene hit me like a punch. The room was no longer a sterile battlefield. It was alive, pulsing with tension. The long table was littered with papers now, graphs and spreadsheets spilling over each other, pens rolling loose like fallen soldiers. The windows framed the Charlotte skyline, but the gray clouds had thickened, casting a dull, oppressive light that sharpened every shadow. Sam stood at the head of the table, his sleeves rolled up, that lopsided grin gone, replaced by a hard line of focus I hadn't seen since he'd scrawled equations on a chalkboard years ago. Beside him, Ethan Caldwell leaned against the edge, arms crossed, his icy gaze flicking to me as I stepped in. The leather chairs were empty, but the air crackled with the ghosts of decisions made in this room. Deals struck, lives shifted, power won and lost. Jake, Sam said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the hum of my thoughts. Good, you're here. Sit. I hesitated, my pulse kicking up as I took in the chaos on the table. This wasn't an interview anymore, it was a war room. I slid into the nearest chair, the leather cold against my back, and set my folder down, its neat edges absurd against the mess. What's going on? I asked, my throat dry, the words rougher than I meant them to be. Sam didn't answer right away. He picked up a sheet of paper, a revenue projection. I saw numbers bleeding red, and handed it to Ethan, who barely glanced at it before tossing it back onto the pile. What's going on, Sim said finally, is a reckoning. We've got an acquisition on the table, biggest one we've ever chased. If we pull it off, Grayson Innovations jumps 3 rungs up the ladder. If we don't, he trailed off, his eyes meeting mine, and I saw it, the weight he'd hinted at downstairs, the everything he'd paid. Ethan pushed off the table, his movements sharp, controlled, like a coiled spring. And we're bleeding time, he said, his voice slicing through the room. The board's meeting tomorrow, and they're itching to pull the plug. We need numbers hard, fast, and airtight, or this thing's dead. His gaze locked onto me, cold and unyielding. But there was something else there now, a flicker of urgency that hadn't been in the interview. You're in, Harper. So prove it. My stomach twisted, a knot of adrenaline and fear tangling tight. This was it. The machine grinding already, and I was a cog now expected to turn or snap. I leaned forward, peering at the mess of data, my mind racing to catch up. Revenue streams, cost projections, asset valuations. It was a storm of figures, chaotic and brutal, but familiar too, like the ledgers Eleanor used to shove at me behind that chip counter. I could feel their eyes on me, Sam's steady, Ethan's piercing, and the room shrank, the air pressing down until it felt like I was drowning in it. Give me a second, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, and pulled a stack of papers closer. The numbers stared back, a snarl of decimals and percentages, but I let them settle, let that old spark flare. My fingers twitched, itching for a pencil, but Ethan's no pencil echoed in my head, and I forced myself to dive in raw. Start with the revenue, I muttered, my eyes darting across the columns. Adjust for the overlap, then the liabilities. The room faded again, the way it always did when the numbers took over, the skyline blurring, the tension softening into a dull roar. But this wasn't a clean puzzle like the interview. This was real, messy, with stakes I could barely grasp. My chest tightened as I worked, the weight of it sinking deeper. Tom's slumped body, Eleanor's trembling hands, the tin box emptied out. I wasn't just proving myself to Sam and Ethan. I was proving I could carry this, that I could be more than the kid who'd watched his family crumble. Minutes bled into each other, my head throbbing as I wrestled the data into shape. Ethan paced now, his shadow slicing across the table, each step a tick of the clock. Sam stayed still, but I could feel his expectation, a quiet pressure that pushed me harder. And then there, a thread, a pattern cutting through the noise. I latched onto it, my breath hitching as the pieces locked in. 8.3 million, I said, leaning back, my voice raw but firm. That's the gap. Cut the overhead here. I jabbed a finger at a line on the sheet and pushed the timeline up by 2 weeks. It holds. Silence swallowed the room, thick and heavy, the kind that makes your skin crawl. Ethan stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing as he snatched the paper from under my hand. He scanned it, his lips pressing tight, then grabbed a calculator, one of those sleek black ones, and punched in the figures. The beeps were sharp, final, and when the screen flashed, he didn't speak, just slid the device across to Sam. Sam glanced at it, then at me, his eyebrows lifting slightly. 8.3, he confirmed, a faint grin tugging at his mouth. Damn, Jake, you're a hell of a sight. Relief washed through me, hot and fleeting, but it didn't last. Ethan's gaze was still on me, colder now, harder, like I'd stolen something he hadn't meant to give. He crossed his arms, leaning back against the table again. It's a start, he said, his tone clipped, but it's not enough. The board won't bite unless we sell it. Hard. And that's on us. All of us. I nodded, my throat tight, the triumph souring into something else, doubt, maybe, or the dawning realization of what I'd signed up for. This wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about power, about standing in a room like this and bending it to my will. I'd wanted this. God, I'd wanted it, but the cost was creeping closer, a shadow I couldn't outrun. Sam clapped a hand on my shoulder, the weight grounding me. You're with us now, he said, his voice low, almost a promise. This is your fight, too. I looked up at him, then at Ethan, and the room felt like a crucible, the air searing with possibility and peril. My hands clenched into fists under the table, nails biting skin, and I felt it, the hunger, the edge of something wild and alive surging through me. I was in the machine, yes, but I wasn't just a cog. I was a player now, and the game was only beginning. The door swung open then, the junior exec bursting in, his face flushed, a phone pressed his ear. Sam, it's the board, he said, breathless. They're moving the meeting up tonight. They want the numbers now. Sam's grin vanished, his jaw tightening as he straightened. Tonight, he repeated, the word a curse. He turned to me, then Ethan, his eyes hard. You heard him. We've got 6 hours to turn this into gold. Jake, you're on point. Run those numbers again, tighter this time. Ethan, get the pitch ready. We're not losing this. Ethan nodded, sharp and decisive, but his gaze flicked to me, a challenge simmering there. Don't screw this up. Harper, he said, his voice low, almost a growl. You're not the only one with skin in this. I met his stare, my pulse hammering, and nodded back. I won't. The room erupted into motion. Papers shuffling, voices overlapping, the skyline darkening as the clouds rolled in. I dove back into the numbers, my mind racing, the spark burning brighter now, fueled by something deeper. Ambition, yes, but also defiance, a need to prove I belonged here, that I could hold my own against Ethan, against the machine itself. The hours blurred, sweat stinging my eyes, my fingers trembling as I recalculated, refined, built a fortress of figures no board could tear down. And through it all, I felt them, Tom's ghost in the grease stains I couldn't wash away, Eleanor's voice daring me to figure it out, Sam's faith pushing me forward, Ethan's cold respect sharpening my edge. This was the climax, the peak of everything I'd fought for, and it was breaking me open, remaking me into something new, someone who could stand in this room and not just survive, but win. The rooftop of Grayson Innovations wasn't meant for lingering. It was a utilitarian sprawl of concrete and steel, dotted with humming HVAC units and crisscrossed by pipes that gleamed faintly under the sodium glow of Charlotte's evening skyline. The air up here was cooler than the stifling heat of the conference room, carrying a sharp bite of autumn that cut through the haze of exhaust drifting up from the streets below. I leaned against the low parapet, my elbows resting on the rough edge, the borrowed tie finally loosened around my neck, dangling like a flag of surrender. The city stretched out before me, a jagged tapestry of lights blinking against the dusk, towers piercing the sky like teeth, the hum of traffic a distant pulse I could feel in my bones. My hands still trembled faintly, the aftershock of 6 relentless hours hunched over spreadsheets and calculators, but the knot in my chest had loosened. replaced by something quieter, heavier. Satisfaction, maybe, or the weight of what I'd just done. The board meeting had ended an hour ago. 6 hours of chaos distilled into 20 minutes of cold, hard numbers and Sam's steady voice cutting through the room like a blade. I'd stood beside him, my tie straightened again, my voice steady as I walked them through the figures, 8.3 million, shaved down to 7.9 with cuts and compromises no one else had seen coming. Ethan had taken the reins after me, his pitch sharp and ruthless, turning my math into a weapon that silenced the skeptics. The board didn't just bite, they swallowed a whole. The acquisition was ours, Grayson Innovations vaulting into a league I could barely fathom, and me, Jake Harper, the kid from Raleigh with grease under his nails, right there in the thick of it. Sam's hand had clapped my shoulder again as we left the room, his grin wide and real, and even Ethan had nodded, a grudging tilt of his head that felt like a truce. Now, up here, the adrenaline was fading, leaving room for the ache to settle in, my legs stiff, my head throbbing, my palms still raw from clenching fists under the table. I pulled a crumpled pack of cigarettes from my pocket, Tom's old habit, one I'd picked up in college when the nights got too long, and lit one, the flame flaring brief and bright against the dark. The first drag burned my throat, bitter and familiar, and I let the smoke curl out into the night, watching it twist toward the skyline. Below me, the city thrummed, alive and indifferent, a machine bigger than the one I'd just survived. But I'd survived it. More than that, I'd won. The door to the rooftop creaked open behind me, a metallic groan that snapped me out of my haze. Footsteps scuffed the concrete, sharp, deliberate, and I didn't need to turn to know who it was. Ethan Caldwell's shadow fell long across the parapet, his silhouette framed by the glow spilling from the stairwell. He didn't say anything at first, just stepped up beside me, his hands shoved into the pockets of that slate gray suit, now wrinkled at the elbows from the day's grind. His blonde hair caught the light, a little mussed, and those icy blue eyes scanned the horizon instead of me, like he was measuring the city against some internal yardstick. Thought I'd find you up here, he said finally, his voice low, stripped of the edge it had carried all day. Sem said you'd vanished after the handshakes. I took another drag, the ember glowing red between my fingers, and shrugged. Needed air. That room was choking me. He snorted a small, dry sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Yeah, it'll do that. He leaned against the parapet, too, close enough that I could smell the faint tang of his cologne over the cigarette smoke, but far enough that the space between us felt deliberate. For a minute, we just stood there, the city's hum filling the silence, the tension from the day uncoiling slow and quiet. You did good down there, he said, breaking the stillness, his tone flat, but not cold. Those cuts you found, I wouldn't have seen them. Not in 6 hours. I glanced at him, surprised, searching his face for the catch. But there wasn't one, just those pale eyes meeting mine, steady and unguarded for once. Thanks, I said, the word rough on my tongue. Your pitch sealed it, though. They didn't stand a chance. A flicker of a smirk tugged at his lips, smaller than the smug one he'd worn in the interview, more human. Team effort, he said, and I caught the faintest trace of irony in it, like he wasn't used to sharing credit. He straightened, pulling a hand from his pocket to rake through his hair, and looked at me proper now, his gaze sharp but not cutting. I was wrong about you, Harper. Thought you'd crack. You didn't. The admission hung there, heavy and unexpected, and I felt something shift, a wall crumbling, maybe, or a line redrawn. I'd spent the day braced for his barbs, his tests, his cold disdain. But this was different. Respect, grudging but real, and it hit me harder than Sam's praise. I tapped the ash from my cigarette, watching it scatter into the wind, and nodded. Took more than I thought it would. I admitted, my voice low, but I'm here. You are, he said, and there was a weight to it, an acknowledgement that went beyond the numbers. He turned back to the skyline, his shoulders easing, and for the first time, I saw him not as the gatekeeper, the predator, but as someone else, someone who'd been ground by this machine too, who'd paid his own price to stand where he did. I exhaled, the smoke thinning out, and let my mind drift back, not to the boardroom, but further to Raleigh, the chipped counter, At Harper Tours, Eleanor's pencil scratching out survival, Tom's boots thudding through the office. That cramped apartment, the tin box, the buses coughing their last. It all felt distant now, a life I'd outrun. But it was still there, stitched into me, driving every step that had landed me on this roof. I'd come here for them. For her, mostly for the woman who'd skimmed fares and dared me to be better. But somewhere along the way, it had become about me too. About proving I could climb out of the wreckage and build something solid, something mine. You ever think about where you started? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, my eyes fixed on the glowing tip of the cigarette. Ethan didn't answer right away. He shifted, his elbow brushing the parapet, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter, rougher. Yeah, small town in Virginia. Father drank himself dead, mother worked doubles at a diner. Didn't have a Sam Grayson to pull me out, just claw and hustle. This place, he gestured vaguely at the building beneath us, the city beyond. It's all I've got. The honesty caught me off guard, raw and unguarded, and I saw him clearer then, another kid from nowhere, fighting the same fight, just with sharper edges. I nodded, slow, the cigarette burning down to my fingers. Guess we're not so different, I said, and meant it. He smirked again, faint but real. Don't get soft on me, Harper. I still think you're a cocky bastard. I grinned, the first real one I'd felt all day, and flicked the cigarette over the edge, watching it spiral down into the dark. Fair enough. You're still an asshole. He laughed, a short, sharp bark that echoed off the concrete, and the tension snapped, leaving something lighter in its wake. Not friendship, not yet, but a tether, a shared stake in this machine we'd both chosen. We stood there a while longer, the city sprawling beneath us, the night settling in thick and cool. My hands steadied, the ache in my chest softening into a quiet resolve, a certainty I hadn't felt before. I'd made it not just into Grayson Innovations, but through it past the tests and the doubts, into something real. The door creaked again, and Sam's voice cut through the quiet. You two done brooding up here? We've got a bottle of bourbon downstairs with our names on it. Ethan glanced at me, one eyebrow raised, and I nodded. Yeah, I said, pushing off the parapet, my voice steady sure. I'm in. We headed down together, Sam leading, Ethan beside me, the stairwell echoing with our steps. The bourbon waited, the night stretched ahead, and for the first time, I didn't feel the weight of the past dragging me back. Raleigh was behind me, Eleanor's sacrifice honored, Tom's shadow fading. Up here, I'd found my footing, my fight, and maybe even a piece of myself I hadn't known was missing. The machine still loomed, gears turning, but I wasn't just in it now. I was part of it, ready to shape it, to carve out my place. As the door clicked shut behind us, the skyline glittered on, vast and unyielding, and I let myself believe it was mine to take,